So now our task is to see if the naturalists are correct and the universe is all there is, or if the Creator created the universe. We definitely need both kinds of revelation to try and stay on track here as we get down to life's most basic, nitty-gritty question. Why is there something instead of nothing? First, we need to establish just exactly what nothing is. And this is very difficult to do completely because, of course, you must use your imagination, which is something, in order to conceptualize nothing. But here we go. Nothing is no things of any kind, whether visible or invisible. No matter, no antimatter, no space, no darkness, no fate, no ideas, no potentials, no possibilities, no laws, no thoughts, no emotions, no time, no past, no present, no future. If you sneak anything at all into, then you don't have nothing. Okay, have you got nothing? Now, how does something come out of that? It cannot. If you have something come out of your nothing, then your nothing wasn't really completely empty, so try again to get nothing. The point is that nothing cannot produce something. Stuff of any kind cannot just pop into existence from true emptiness. Now, some theoretical physicists who study quantum mechanics try to say that matter can just appear out of nothing. But by observing carefully, you'll discover that their nothing wasn't really empty. They try to sneak in laws like gravity or concepts like order. But that's cheating. I'm talking about real, honest-to-goodness nothingness. Stuff cannot pop into existence out of true nothingness. Now, since we can all confirm that stuff does indeed exist, it follows then that something must be eternal, uncreated, always existing, with no beginning and no end. There are only two choices for eternal things. Either the natural world itself is eternal, or an eternal creator outside of the natural world exists. For a long time, many philosophies and religions taught that the universe is eternal. Up until the early 1900s, many scientists generally thought this too. Then along came Einstein and his buddies, and they discovered that this universe does indeed have a beginning. And they can even give it a date, roughly 13.7 billion years ago. Now, what does this mean? If the universe itself has a beginning, then that means it's not eternal. It has a creator that is entirely separate. Naturalists are adamantly unwilling to entertain the thought of a creator and are very intent on finding a natural explanation for the existence of the universe that does not require God. An early option was an oscillating universe. Maybe the universe explodes, expands, and then contracts back in on itself only to expand and explode again. The Eastern mystics like this option too because they need an eternal universe for their worldview. The recent discovery of dark matter in the universe and the amount of it has eliminated the viability of this theory. There is just too much dark matter in the universe to allow it to contract back in for a new Big Bang. No oscillating universe and no Hindu-Buddhist concept of a reincarnating universe. The universe will just keep expanding indefinitely. A second option for an eternal universe, which is currently very much in vogue, is the multiverse theory. The idea here is that there are an infinite number of random physical universes out there with an infinite number of chance occurrences going on in them, and we just happen to be living in this one. There is, so far, absolutely no real objective evidence to support the idea of multiple physical universes. And if they do exist, they can never overlap each other. So even if there are other universes out there, we probably can never know it. Currently, the multiverse theorists are trying to figure out if another universe has ever bumped into our universe. Universes can't overlap, but maybe they can play bumper cars. No evidence so far. Even if there are other physical universes out there, it just pushes the question of why is there something instead of nothing further out into space. We still have the question, can finite, natural, physical, constantly changing matter which exists in time extend into the infinite past and infinite future? Remember, God tells us that he is a spirit beyond time and that he never changes. So our guardrail of Scripture tells us that these are at least 3 of the characteristics necessary for something to be infinite. Matter does not possess these 3 characteristics. Matter changes constantly. Matter is stuck on a timeline that goes only in one direction, and matter is physical, not spiritual. It simply doesn't qualify to be eternal. See how corrective our guardrails can be? Now, is there evidence for a created physical universe? There is tons. It is called the anthropic principle, or fine-tuning of the universe. And again, this is a topic that Chaz is going to get into later, but at this point I will just say that there is a list of 140 characteristics of the universe that must fall within very, very narrow parameters for advanced life to exist on this one little isolated planet. Change any one of them beyond these tight parameters, and advanced life would not be possible. The odds of all of these components happening just as exactly as they did are astronomical. So we come back to our basic question, why is there something instead of nothing? Can finite, constantly changing matter existing in time be eternal? Or did the eternal, unchanging Spirit of God, which exists outside of time, speak the universe into existence? Both books of Revelation are clear. The eternal God created the natural world out of nothing. Psalm 111 says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. All who follow his precepts have good understanding. To him belongs eternal praise." Okay, so now that we've got the universe started, and it's clear that it did not come about by natural processes, we're going to go back to our evolution box and begin to talk about life on this planet and look at the different types of evolution. Although evolutionists lump them all together, there are actually 5 kinds of evolution. 3 microevolution, which means little changes, and 2 macroevolution, which means big changes. And first, we're going to look at the beginning of life. The question is, did life begin by a natural process on the early Earth, namely chemical evolution? Is it possible? Chemical evolution comes under the macroevolution heading because going from non-life to life is a huge change. As I mentioned, the universe is about 13.7 billion years old. The Earth is about 4.6 billion years old. When the Earth was only about 30 to 50 million years old, a planet about 1/10 the size of the Earth smashed into the Earth to form the Moon. Then, about 4 billion years ago, came the late Heavy Bombardment, which showered the entire Earth with giant asteroids and comets. Now, amazingly, only a few million years after the late Heavy Bombardment ended, fully developed, microscopic marine life sprang up suddenly in abundance. How did this happen? Some of you may remember from your high school biology class learning about the Miller-Urey experiment done in the 1950s. These scientists claim to have known how the building blocks necessary for life had formed in the pre-life environment on Earth. The prebiotic or primordial soup is what this environment has been called. The only problem is that scientists now know 2 things. The early Earth did not have the right conditions to form the prebiotic or primordial soup. It never existed, and the compounds formed in the experiment didn't line up in the right direction, which is very important. This experiment was elegant and wonderful, but as it turns out, entirely irrelevant. The conditions that actually existed on the early Earth were not a primordial soup that might easily promote life. The environment was actually extremely harsh. So harsh, in fact, that it rules out any reasonable natural explanation for the emergence of life on Earth, and yet life did indeed emerge at the earliest possible moment, and in its simplest form was far more complex than Charles Darwin could possibly have imagined. Once again, scientists are scrambling for an answer. How could life begin without God? The choices so far? 1. Life was seeded here from outer space. Nope. No evidence whatsoever. Sorry, you UFO lovers. Next, a hypothetical fourth law of thermodynamics has been proposed. The proposal says that this law spontaneously produced a high degree of order, complexity, and information content where none existed. Now, this hypothetical law directly contradicts the well-established second law of thermodynamics, which says that all systems in the universe proceed towards increasing disorder and decreasing complexity. So two opposing laws are proposed to exist. Now, just living on Earth readily reveals which law is true. Do things naturally tend towards order or chaos? And finally, I like this one. Life is inherently emergent. Scientists say that there's just something about life that causes it to spring up spontaneously when the conditions are right. Life is inevitable and necessary. Remember, the conditions weren't right. This I would label evolution of the gaps or magical thinking. Darwin himself did not know how life began, and over 150 years later, science is still without an answer to the origin of life. However, dual revelation clearly teaches that life came about by the purposefully orchestrated and timed sequence of probability-defying events as the efficiently and effectively engineered and timed work of the biblical creator. In other words, how did life begin? Life is a miraculous gift from God. Science does not have any credible evidence for the chemical evolution of life from non-life, the first type of macroevolution. Now that we have life started, we come to the point where the formal Darwinian theory of evolution finally kicks in 45 minutes later. The actual theory of evolution really applies only after life has begun. Everyone agrees that change occurs in various species all the time. Again, the big issue here really is microevolution versus macroevolution. Micro means small and macro means big. We've just seen that the chemical macroevolutionary process of going from non-life to life without a designer is impossible. What about microevolution, or small changes within species? On his famous trip to the Galapagos Islands in the mid-1800s, Charles Darwin observed the various organisms changed over time to adapt to their changing surroundings, and he postulated that those organisms best able to make changes would be the most likely to survive. And this is true. The genetic diversity within each species on Earth allows changes to occur within those species. Just think of dog breeds. Modern dogs are descended from the wolf. There are over 150 breeds of dogs. This is a remarkable variety available for genetic expression and in living creatures, and that variety can help species adapt to the changes in their surroundings. Survival of the fittest, if you will. This is genetic microevolution, and it happens continually. Another kind of microevolution is microbial mutation. Single-celled organisms that live in large populations and reproduce asexually have been observed to undergo frequent microevolution. We've all heard about bacteria that have mutated and become resistant to antibiotics. Researchers have been able to observe thousands of generations of life in these organisms. Guess what? Bacteria stay bacteria in every generation, no matter what the mutation. Microbial mutation is the second type of microevolution. The problem really comes when microevolution is used as evidence for macroevolution, because remember, evolutionists do not like to differentiate between micro and macro because they lose too much of their evidence that way. Here is an example of a macro versus micro controversy. Dr. Francis Collins is a brilliant man, scientist, and incidentally a committed Christian. He was in the video series we saw here last fall. He is also a theistic evolutionist, meaning that he believes in God and evolution. In his book called The Language of God, Dr. Collins addresses the issue of macroevolution, one species mutating into another species, and he assures the reader that it actually does happen. He writes, "There is a certain species of saltwater, armor-plated stickleback fish that ended up living in fresh water due to the melting glaciers. He tells us this stickleback fish adapted to the fresh water and it eventually lost its armor plates by a specific genetic mutation. So now this stickleback is considered a different species. This," he writes, "shows that the dividing lines between species are less strict than were formerly thought, and therefore we see macroevolution at work." Now, it is true that this kind of genetic speciation takes place commonly in nature, especially when one group of a species gets isolated from the main population. It is very difficult for scientists to define precisely what a species is. However, the bottom line is that in this instance, the stickleback is still a fish. This type of small mutation, going from armor to no armor, is actually a loss of genetic information and not necessarily beneficial. It is a huge leap of faith to say that this small change demonstrates how massive changes could occur that explain macroevolution. For instance, how does Mr. Stickleback's armor even come close to explaining how an original single-celled organism could evolve into two entirely separate kinds of life, plants and animals, and arrange it so that the plants just happen to become the only food source for the animals? And so, I would challenge Dr. Collins and argue that this stickleback mutation is not an example of macroevolution, but really just another form of microevolution. And I would also say, beware of microevolution masquerading as macroevolution. There are actually many categories of dispute about macroevolution and the theory of universal common descent. A common one is the fossil record. You're probably all familiar with Darwin's famous Tree of Life's history. The connecting lines make it look like all these species are connected at the one source, and then life gradually changes from one form to another. There are, in fact, no undisputed transitional forms in the fossil record. There are some mighty odd-looking creatures in the distant past, but the latest evidence says no, they are not transitional specimens. There are no part reptile, part bird creatures, no part reptile, part mammal creatures. Every time a new species appears in the fossil record, it is fully formed and complete. The actual fossil record without the added connecting lines would look something like this. Remember, Darwin observed microevolution. If macroevolution were really true, it should be obvious. There should be all kinds of creatures walking around with partially formed limbs or wings or organs popping out everywhere. We should be able to see it and happening now. But since we can't see any evidence, evolutionists just take their arguments to smaller